between the rows and cabbage.
Hello, everyone. My name is Bonnie Marmer, and I am co-president of the Point San Pedro Road Coalition. And we have a big crowd tonight on this important issue of our roadway traffic and safety. We will look forward to having our speakers make their presentations with lots of information for everyone, and to having a lively Q&A. I'm sure that's going to be coming up. I'd like to thank Kevin Hagerty, our Roadway Committee Chair, for his efforts in putting this all together. He's received a lot of questions in advance, and we appreciate that folks have been sending in their questions. That's very helpful. And I'm going to be turning this over to Kevin, who will introduce our panelists and will also tell you how the meeting is going to proceed this evening. Before I do that, I just want to thank Alan Shavitz, our webmaster, for his tech support and putting this all together. The invaluable help of Alan Shavitz is always appreciated, and certainly his help on our website is appreciated as well. It's a lot of work, and we want to extend our thanks to him. So without further ado, though, I want to introduce Kevin Hagerty, the Point San Pedro Road Coalition Roadway Committee Chair. Kevin?
Thanks, Bonnie. Good evening. As Bonnie said, my name is Kevin Hagerty. I'm chairman of the Coalition's Roadway Committee, and I will be the event moderator tonight. Before we start, I want to review with you some program logistics. This 90-minute recorded program will include two presentations: a presentation from Dan Dawson, Principal Transportation Planner with the County Public Works Department, who will discuss the county's proposal to implement a roadway lane reduction from Loch Lomond Drive to just east of Bayside Park. The second presenter will be Lauren Devaney, traffic engineer from the City of San Rafael Public Works Department, who will provide an update on issues related to the Night Drive, Peacock Drive, and Riviera Drive crosswalks. These presentations will be followed by an opportunity for area residents to ask questions and to provide comments on the information presented earlier in the program. If you wish to ask a question or make a comment, I ask that you use the Q&A feature button at the bottom of the Zoom webinar page to submit your written questions and comments. I will consolidate the questions and concerns and share them with the presenters as time permits. If your question does not get asked tonight, I would encourage you to email Dan or Lauren directly. They have both agreed to respond to your emails. If you send an email, I ask that you copy me so that I can ensure that the question is answered. Several times during the webinar, we will post a slide with Dan, Lauren, and my email addresses. I want to emphasize that the lane reduction proposal has not been formally approved, nor has the coalition taken a position on the proposal. The coalition's role is to provide a community forum where county staff can provide or can review the current situation and the goals of the change, present the proposal for addressing the issues, discuss benefits and concerns of the changes, and then provide residents with the opportunity to express their concerns in a question and answer period. Finally, I wanted to share with you that the Point San Pedro Road Coalition, as in the past, and will continue to meet closely or work closely with city and county staff on traffic and safety issues along the roadway, and will report these findings of these conversations either on the coalition's website or at community meetings. I now want to introduce Dan Dawson, Principal Transportation Planner from the county's Public Works Department, who will share with you information on the proposed lane change. Dan?
Great, thank you, Kevin. Hopefully everyone can see the screen. So this project is to look at the potential of restriping Point San Pedro Road between Loch Lomond, the marina, and the east side of Bayside Park. Okay, now we're not gonna. There we go. All right, so the roadway was originally widened to 4 lanes in 1971. That was at a time where the Point San Pedro Peninsula had a considerable amount of development potential, and in anticipation of that, the roadway was widened. At that time, the Bay Conservation Development Commission required a bike lane to be provided along that roadway. However, at the time the road was built, that lane was not installed and has subsequently been used for parking. In 1976, China Camp State Park was established, which basically ended most of the residual development potential out in the eastern end of the peninsula. And so the need for the widened roadway wasn't as it was earlier, but it had already been constructed by that time. So there it is, and as it is today. Jumping forward to last year, the county, as part of its ADA compliance, Americans with Disabilities Act compliance, began looking at Bayview or Bayside Park because it had several issues with accessibility, as well as it has had several things where it had just seen better days and was certainly eligible for some rehabilitation. And so in development of that plan to reconstruct the park, BCDC again required a permit for that work and revisited the 1971 permit that required the bike lane, and as a part of that required that the bike lane be installed as a result of that project. The end result is that the parking that was currently or has been permitted along the frontage of the park will have to be removed to provide the required bike lane. With that, the community was certainly concerned about the loss of parking along the park, along with the likely result of people either parking back along in front of the houses that are to the west of the park, or parking on Main Drive and crossing the roadway, which was not desirable to either end. So at that point, the traffic and engineering staff looked at the alternative approach to provide the required bike lane and retain the parking, and also look for the opportunity to provide some additional safety benefits. And so what has come up is what is being presented to you this evening. So the basic project is reducing the current 2-lane section of roadway eastbound between Bayview Avenue and the east end of Bayside Park. So the result would be 1 vehicle lane, a buffered bike lane, and then the parking lane as it exists now. This would retain the parking for the homes fronting on Point San Pedro Road, enables the parking along the park to remain, and it would meet the BCDC permit requirements that mandate the bike lane be provided. So the concept would be that the merge from 2 lanes to 1 would begin midway between Loch Lomond Drive and Bayview Drive. And by the time you get to Bayview Drive, then it would be narrowed down to a single lane. Once you get past the park, it would open back up again to 2 lanes and then retain the existing bike lane that runs along the Bayside out towards Riviera Drive. This proposal would not change the posted speed limits. It would not affect emergency vehicle access because the proposal would not involve moving any curbs or adding hardscape or anything like that, or putting up pylons. So the amount of pavement would remain the same. It would also result in continuous eastbound bike lane from San Pedro Cove all the way to Biscayne Drive. And then also in the westbound direction, as a separate task would go between Riviera Drive and Manderley Road, which which would result in continuous westbound bike lanes between Biscayne Drive and Balboa. All of westbound would remain with 2 vehicle lanes west of Riviera Drive as it does now. One of the concerns, among others, that we've heard over the years is the lack of continuous bike lanes that force cyclists to ride in the roadway. So this would provide continuous lanes for this segment. So just graphically representing where this would be, the lane merge would be, well, in the sort of mustard colored line, and then the single lane would be the orange section. And then how it would look, if you looked at it in section, this would be looking east, like towards the bay, where westbound headed towards downtown San Rafael is on the left side, showing how the lanes would remain as they are now, with 2 11-foot vehicle lanes, and then the buffered bike lane. In the eastbound direction with the single lane option, the drive lane would actually widen by a foot to 12 feet. A buffer, and then the bike lane would be provided, and then the parking lane, which is what it currently is at 8 feet, would be up against the curb. One of the main concerns that's been expressed is about impact of traffic flow and what happens when you reduce the number of lanes on the roadway. Again, this road was designed to handle much higher traffic flows on the assumption there was going to be much more development. The standard capacity assumption for a vehicle lane in this type of setting, which is an arterial roadway, has a minimal amount of cross conflicts, is 1,100 vehicles per hour. So by minimal friction, it means that there's no traffic signals or stop signs along the main roadway. There are very few intersections, and the oncoming traffic is separated by a median, and there are also not any commercial driveways, which tend to have much higher traffic volumes and the turning movements into them. So this chart is using count data at various sections along the roadway, where average daily traffic is, as it suggests, the average number of cars each day that go through. The leftmost column is the both directions. The second column is only the eastbound direction. The peak hour figures for the morning and afternoon, the peak hour is when looking at the total number of vehicles going through during each of those periods, what 60-minute period has the highest number of vehicles going through. And so, as you can see here, at Marina Boulevard, which is down near the high school, the numbers are obviously higher, and then the further out you go on the peninsula, the numbers decrease. So looking at the figures for Lochinvar, Loch Lomond, and then also at Night Drive, you can see that the numbers are well below, in fact, half of what would be assumed as the capacity of a single lane on the roadway. Or in other words, you could double the number of cars driving out there now with one lane, and it would still be under the assumed capacity limit. So in terms of multiple benefits with this, besides addressing the permitting requirements for the park, this would improve visibility and sight lines, particularly in the section where the houses are, where right now, for those residents trying to back out of their driveways into a live traffic lane is challenging at best, particularly if there are additional vehicles parked along the roadway. That further decreases the visibility. And for drivers who are coming out of Beach Road or Marine Drive, for some of the same reasons, visibility would be improved by providing an opportunity to pull out further than you can normally do right now, since where the bike lane is, the vehicles would be shifted over towards the left side of the roadway, and therefore your viewing angle for vehicles approaching will be a greater distance and provide for increased safety in terms of providing greater reaction time and response time. And then also with the issue of collisions, which have happened in this area, keeping vehicles to the left creates, and having the bike lane in place creates a buffer zone that would aid in reducing the number of potential errant vehicles crashing into parked cars, which has happened on several occasions. Having a single lane discourages speeding. The posted speed limit in this section is 40 miles an hour. And so by having a single lane at 40 miles an hour, it discourages or precludes the ability of people who may be in a big rush to zip in and out of lanes to get around folks. Creates a more metered effect. It doesn't slow down traffic below the posted speed limit unless somebody is going slower, but there's not an impact in terms of traffic flow. And traffic calming is intended to create a more metered and even traffic flow rather than just trying to slow things down The other benefit of having the bike lane and buffer next to the parked cars is that people getting in and out of those parked cars, particularly on the driver's side, right now are stepping into a live lane of traffic. And given the curvature of the roadway with visibility and what have you, it can be challenging to try and guess when somebody might be coming around the corner. This will provide a suitable buffer for that as well. And then, as I mentioned before, this will help provide continuous bicycle facilities, whereas right now cyclists must ride in the roadway in the traffic lane, and at the speed of vehicles at 40 miles an hour. That's not exactly an ideal situation for mixing conditions. So let me see if I can get this to work to jump to the diagram that shows. All right. Let's try this again. All right. Okay. So hopefully folks are able to see the site schematic, the overhead diagrams here. The top section starts at Manderley Road and gets to just shy of the Loch Lomond Marina. On the south or eastbound side, south side of the road, there will be a bike lane provided starting at San Pedro Cove and continuing to the east. And then on the westbound side, it shows what's already signed for no parking and has some bike lane designations that would just formalize that part. Jumping down to the second portion is starting at Loch Lomond Drive. Continuing eastward, the merge begins right about the point of the bend, and then is completed by the time you get to Bayview Drive. Once you get to Bayview Drive, then you're in the one-lane section with the diagram that I showed earlier. Continuing through the weave to getting towards Bayview Park. And then at Bayview Park, at the east end of Bayview Park, there would be another transition zone that would go back to being 2 lanes with a bike lane, and then that would continue eastward towards Riviera Drive and ultimately Biscayne, where there's already existing bike lanes in that section. And in the westbound direction, you would also have bike lanes provided using some of which are already signed for bike lanes, others which are not, but retaining the 2 vehicle lanes and then using what's some bike lane, some shoulder as a formally buffered bike lane. So that is the conclusion of my presentation. We can certainly jump back to this as folks have questions, but we'll hand it back to Kevin.
Thank you, Dan. Our next speaker is Lauren Devaney from the city of San Rafael. Over the last couple of years, there's been a lot of concerns and complaints about safety of the crosswalks on the whole roadway, but specifically east of the park at night at Peacock and at Riviera. So we've been working with the city on trying to improve those crosswalks. And so I invited Lauren to come to talk about the challenges, what the city's done, what the challenges are for doing more to make the areas, those crosswalks safer. So I'll turn it over to Lauren.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you everyone for having me tonight. So again, my name is Lauren Devaney with San Rafael Public Works, and I have a really brief update. I don't have any slides, but we have been working with Kevin and the Road Coalition and residents who write in and ask for enhancements at the crossings of Night, Peacock, and Riviera. So we have added signage, striping. There were reflectors put in at some point. We made sure that those, they've been hit with cars or they just fall off after time. So we replaced the reflectors that are along the crosswalk. We've trimmed our own vegetation in the medians. We've worked with the homeowners associations to trim vegetation that might be coming over from the residential side. We know that there are flags out that people can use to cross the street. I understand the neighborhood put those out, and we're at a point where we are looking at we're leaning on the federal guidelines. So, and they study crossings all over the United States, and the guidelines say that with a posted speed of 40 miles an hour. And people are often going over that 40 miles an hour. With that speed and that number of lanes that a pedestrian has to cross, the guidelines say that we would need to install hybrid beacons, which are the same setup as the new crossing at San Rafael High School. So that's where we're at. Happy to continue working with the community on other signage, but the reason that the kind of between signs and a pedestrian hybrid beacon are the rectangular rapid flashing beacons. Those are the setups that you see way on the side of the street. The road is just too wide, and studies have shown that they're just not effective with that wide of a road and drivers going that fast. So that's my update. Happy to answer any questions.
Hey, Lauren, thank you. We have a whole bunch of questions, so let's get started. So Dan, you were talking about the benefits of the lane reduction, providing, slowing speed down, providing a better environment for bicyclists, and providing parking at the park. So many of the questions ask whether or not the driver here is the loss of parking in front of the park. Would the county have implemented these changes if that hadn't been a factor?
Well, the parking issue at the park certainly helped drive the solution, but there have been other concerns expressed about, particularly in this exact section, of the number of collisions, speeding, just the curving nature of the roadway, what types of interventions might be undertaken to try and address some of those concerns. And part of the issue is this section doesn't, with the 2 streets that intersected at Beach and Marin, neither one of those meet what are called warrants for doing things like traffic signals or anything like that that would be the means of metering traffic through that section.
Okay, you talked about traffic counts. Did you incorporate, do those counts or analysis incorporate school buses or huge trucks from the quarry? And how will they impact traffic if we go down to one lane?
The vehicle counts are straight vehicle counts. Part of the thought with the going with one lane in this direction, at least as far as the gravel trucks are concerned, is going eastbound to the quarry. They are unladen, so they do not have a problem keeping up with the flow of traffic, as opposed to a fully laden truck, which would, particularly going through a hillier section like this, might get bogged down and create, potential slowdowns. But going eastbound towards the quarry, that's not seen as an issue.
Have you, has the county taken a look at any alternative solutions to addressing those issues?
To addressing, well, the park permit issue, if the bike lane is not provided and the parking in front of the park can't be there, there is no other way to fit in what BCDC would require without taking advantage of the rightmost vehicle lane. Going through the section in front of the houses, the reducing it to one lane, whether there's a bike lane there or not, would certainly help create a calming effect and help modulate some of the speeds going through there, because there has been concerns about speeding, and certainly some of the collision reports reflect that. But again, because it's a constrained roadway, right-of-way, there's not really opportunities to do anything like put in roundabouts or other types of solutions that can also have a calming effect on traffic speeds.
Has the county ever considered going back to BCDC and asking for an exemption to their policy regarding a bike lane in front of the park?
I'll have Doran speak to that one.
Yeah, this is Doran Hill. I'm the Public Works Capital Division Manager. Erin Riley is the Senior Project Manager on the project. Many of you are probably familiar with her name. And I want to preface this with, we've had many discussions with BCDC on exemptions, on alternates, and what we have is their final decision. And so there's been many iterations with BCDC on a number of options, and this is their final word. The need for the 1971 bike lane, that was part of the permitting back then. So hopefully that answers that question.
Another question is, did the county ever consider taking part of the parkland to create the dedicated bicycle lane?
I don't think that was ever considered, but I'm going to say I'm not the subject matter expert, but I've not heard that as an option before.
I think you would face a design challenge even if it was considered, in that park slopes down towards the bay, and the amount of width required for a bicycle lane and a sidewalk, if it was all pushed onto that property, would create additional challenges from an Americans with Disabilities Act compliance in terms of the slope, and that the park itself is not that large. It's a relatively shallow but long strip, and so the more paving you put on it, the less landscape space there is for people to enjoy.
There's a question, under the proposed scenario, would there be a right turn lane onto Beats Drive?
There's not any dedicated turn lanes shown, but as part of the design, the striping layout, as the intersection is approached, there would be a space where people can pull out of the through lane to begin to execute their right turn.
Okay, so someone traveling east on Point San Pedro Road if there's a pedestrian crossing the street at Beach and they have to slow down to let the pedestrian by, would that block traffic heading eastbound?
No, because they would be off to the right. I mean, similar with other intersections that have bike lanes, as you approach the intersection, usually within about 100 feet or so of it, the lane lines, the bike lane lines and what have you are dashed to, into the provisions of the vehicle code and allow you to cross into the bike lane to execute your turning maneuver. So striping can be set up to provide a clear space, clear area where people can move out of the through lane to execute their turn, whether there's if somebody is crossing the street or even just to slow down to make the turn.
There is some parking right now between Loch Lomond Drive and Beach on the right, of course, on the right-hand side of the road. Would that parking be eliminated?
Yes, most of it would. It would begin again at the point that as the merge occurs, when the merge is over far enough that the bike lane transition, which would also follow that merge line, could fit a vehicle, then parking would be permitted after that point.
Has the police department and other emergency departments been consulted with this proposed change, and have they commented on it?
We haven't received any comments. The sheriff's department, sort of a hybrid, at least as far as the county is concerned. The highway patrol typically does law enforcement or traffic enforcement in unincorporated areas. I don't know if the San Rafael City Police Department has had any input on it, but because there's not any vertical elements being introduced like barriers, pylons, or what have you, the ability to get emergency vehicles through would not be any different than it is now. If there was, for some reason, there was a collision that obstructed the vehicle lane, that's, the bike lane would be there to negotiate around it, much as people can go in the right lane today to get around an obstruction in the left lane.
Can you maybe you could pull up one of your slides again? How will bikes handle door opening upon them? And is the proposed situation different than or better than the present situation?
Well, the bike lane would be 6 feet wide. Let's see if I can share this again. So the bike lane would be 6 feet wide. There's a 4-foot buffer here. People riding in this area can ride anywhere. I mean, a typical bike lane is either 4 or 5 feet. So there's actually an extra foot built into this to allow for the notion of cars being parked there and somebody might step out. So there is actually more room available than there would be under a conventional bike lane situation.
Okay, and to clarify, this proposal would only affect the eastbound traffic and it would not affect the westbound traffic. Is that correct?
In terms of the number of lanes, yes.
Yes. Here's a comment about the concern for speeding. There was a concern that once the lane merges back to 2 in front of Linwood, there's a long stretch of roadway there that this person believes that people would speed up tremendously and it would make the roadway more unsafe.
Well, east of the park, there is certainly the possibility at a later date to consider retaining 1 lane all the way along that section, all the way to Riviera Drive. Leaving it as 2 lanes provides an opportunity for people to get around for whatever reason. But again, because the vehicle counts are so low out at this end of the corridor, that having a single lane there would not have any impact on traffic. So it could be 1 or 2 lanes east of the park, but that's not being contemplated as part of this treatment for the time being.
Okay, before I ask the next question, Alan did put up the screen that has the contact information for Dan, for Lauren, and myself. So if your question doesn't get answered, or you have another question, I would encourage you to send an email to the appropriate person. Make sure I'm copied so I can follow up and make sure you get an answer. Let's see, these are really good questions. And a lot of them are similar in nature. Lauren, here's one for you. Why can't we put in 3 additional crossing lights at those intersections?
So the cost of the new crossing at San Rafael High School is about $400,000. There's a significant cost associated with these improvements too that I didn't mention before. The city is really good about looking for funding and applying for funding. So if we see a grant opportunity that comes up, you know, we'll be sure to consider applying for improvements out there when we see an opportunity come up.
Also, are there other things that other mechanical or non-mechanical solutions that the city could implement in crosswalks in the area?
There are other traffic control devices. You know, someone had mentioned in the Q&A that stop signs can be a really cheap solution. You need to be really careful with a stop sign with a speed of 40 miles an hour. You need to make sure you would want to, like, the side street volumes have to be high enough, or the number of pedestrians crossing has to be high enough. So in the past, when I've looked at it, a stop sign is not appropriate for these intersections.
And can you talk a little bit about the red flags that are located in the crosswalks, on both sides of the crosswalks?
I don't know too much about them. The city did not put them in. I've seen them in other places that people can use them to draw drivers' attention when they're crossing. I don't know much more than that.
Okay. Let's see. How many parking spaces will be, does the park need in front of the park? I mean, has there been projections in terms of how many spaces are needed to accommodate use of the park? How many of those spaces would be disabled? Much of these improvements in the park are done for accessibility reasons. Have you done any projections on how many spaces you should have to handle the load there?
There's not any projections on how many spaces should be provided. There will be one accessible space provided as part of this. That was what, from the get-go, that was part of the intent. The remainder of the curb frontage up to the eastern end of the park, or up to the point of where the disabled space is, which is up towards the eastern end of the park. Those spaces, that curb length would all be available for parking, and generally, as a rule of thumb for curbside parking, you assume about 25 feet per parking space. 22 at the least, but because there's no proposal to put parking T's, like little T painted markers you see in some places to actually allocate parking spaces. It's kind of a free-for-all. It's assumed that would continue. And so to the extent people use it. And the same is true of it along the frontage where the houses are. To the extent people park efficiently or don't, that determines the number of available spaces.
And in a comment, I think one of the reasons, this person says they believe one of the reasons that it's important to have available parking to those that use the park is one of the options would be Main Drive, and you'd have to cross the street there That's a very, and there's no crosswalk there, and there can't be because it doesn't meet state requirements. That's a very dangerous crosswalk because of the blind curve. Do you have any comments on that?
Well, that was definitely one of the issues that arose with when the notion of losing the parking in front of the park came up, is that it would force people to either park on Main Drive or push them westward to park in front of the houses along Point San Pedro. So that's not an ideal place to cross. And on the one hand, the metering effect of going to one lane in eastbound direction would perhaps make it a little bit easier to get across, just in terms of being able to see, and you're only trying to, as a pedestrian, you're only crossing across one lane of one active lane of traffic. And certainly coming in the westbound direction, the visibility, you can see quite a ways down, so that's not as much of a concern. So there is sort of a side benefit, even if people are inclined to park on Main Drive, but the main issue was to try and retain the parking in front of the park, so that would not be necessary.
Okay, let's see. As I've said, a lot of these questions are that you've already answered. Here's one for Lauren. Lauren, what is a hybrid beacon?
A hybrid beacon is what was installed in front of San Rafael High School. So it's dark unless it's activated by a pedestrian. At that point, it's that like set of 3 lights. It starts to flash yellow and then it goes red. And it hangs over the street versus the flashing lights, which are just way off to the side.
Okay.
Hey, Kevin, this is Bill Guerin.
Sure, Bill.
Lauren, would you explain the function of the light? Because I think a lot of people are still confused about how to use the crosswalk at San Rafael High School. When the light flashes red, you watch pedestrians cross the street. When the light starts to flash red as opposed to be red, you have the opportunity to move through the intersection. Could you just go through that for people that are using it every day and probably are still a little confused about how that works?
Yeah. So I'll go over it as a driver. As a driver, it'll stay dark unless a pedestrian's there. Once the pedestrian push button is crossed, the light will turn on and it'll be solid yellow. Shoot. So I have the flashing red part. I think that's the most confusing. It'll go into yellow to let drivers know, it's gonna turn red. So then it goes into solid red. When you have a solid red light, drivers don't continue forward. When it goes into flashing red, then drivers can start driving after they check that the crossing is clear. And then after it flashes red, it goes dark again. So flashing red, stop, look if it's clear, you can go.
Thanks, Lauren.
Thank you, Lauren. Lauren, maybe you could, there's been some questions regarding lowering the speed limit as a safety measure. Can you explain to people how speed limits are set? I know, and why it may not be possible to lower the speed limit?
Yeah, so speed limits are set based on a speed survey. So someone goes out there with a radar gun and they take a sample of 100 cars, not in a platoon or anything. If a car is traveling by itself, you document that speed. After you get 100 of those cars, you figure out what the 85th percentile speed is. So the speed at which 85% of drivers are going. Some benefits, and Dan talks about this with going down to one lane, it has traffic calming effects. So we may find if this project moves forward, you could survey that stretch of road, because Point San Pedro Road has like 4 different sections that have been surveyed. You could survey that stretch of road, find because of the lane reduction, people are driving slower. You could possibly lower speed limit that way. But basically, jurisdictions can't just lower speed limits because they want to or the community wants to. It's really driven by the speeds that have been documented that the drivers are going.
Okay, thank you. Here's a question. Why was the bike lane requirement not enforced up to this point?
That is a question probably lost to the sands of time. It was required in 1971. The road was constructed, and for whatever reason at that time, the bike lane was not designated. Granted, at that time, there were the structure, the way bike facilities are defined or established by Caltrans and the Highway Design Manual. So there's a hierarchy, and at that point in time, perhaps it was a little more unclear, but it did specify providing a bike lane.
Okay, here's a comment. So to be clear, is the striping you are this is the striping you're talking about. Are you thinking about imposing stop lights?
There would not be any traffic signals as part of this, nor would there be any stop signs on Point San Pedro. The side streets would still retain the stop signs that they have now.
How involved was the bike coalition in this planning effort?
It was presented to the county's bicycle advisory committee, which is comprised of local cyclists and also has a representative from the bike coalition who also attends. And they were very supportive of it, mainly because it provides a specific facility for cyclists.
So you mentioned earlier that the traffic counts include the trucks to the quarry. Here's a question for someone who asked if there are specific volumes or truck volumes that you're aware of that travel to the quarry.
The traffic counts that we have just count vehicles. To conduct that kind of a survey, usually you have to have somebody sitting out there and counting which type, as was the mechanical count is going on, tabulating how much of each kind of vehicle. I mean, there are now certain types of cameras and things that can do that same thing, but the quarry is restricted by its permit as to how many trucks can go out there. And from several people, I've heard that they've been well under that limit for the last few years at least, but that doesn't preclude them from going to a higher number at some subsequent date.
Here's a question, and maybe Lauren can jump in on this one as well as Dan, but have you ever considered extending the one-lane calming strategy down to Riviera Drive, where the road narrows to one lane again? And if so, and this is my part of the question, Lauren, you talked earlier about the state regulations that limit the solution, because we have a 4-lane road. The state sort of mandates what kind of equipment we can use, but if you have a 2-lane road, would there be more opportunities to install equipment that's not as expensive? And that's either for Lauren or Bill.
Yeah, I'll just answer the first part of it, and maybe Lauren can jump in on the second part. The county did suggest that as from a starting point, that we just continue the lane reduction all the way to the end. We chose not to do that because there is a bike path there today. And we think having 2 lanes gives options to drivers after they go past the park. So we did not consider or did not decide to continue the lane reduction all the way to the end. Obviously that can happen if there is a consensus among the community that that's the right thing to do. But we think it's better to have the option of having 2 lanes there. Lauren, I don't know if there's an opportunity for less expensive equipment for pedestrians crossing, for instance, if we do only have 2 lanes versus 4, but I think it would be 3 lanes versus 4 in any case. And I wonder if you'd comment on that.
Yeah, there is opportunity if you were to get it, if we're going to get it down to 3 conflicting lanes with pedestrians, or even down to 2. The guidance does say, yeah, you can consider the flashing beacons instead of the big overhead system. Because the biggest points of conflict for pedestrians is the speed that cars are going and the number of lanes that they have to cross. And again, a benefit with going down in the number of lanes, that can have a traffic calming benefit too. So maybe you'd be looking at 35-mile-an-hour speeds. And if you have those speeds, then you would put in just the flashing beacons on the side of the road.
So I think the position of San Rafael is we wanted to keep things kind of as they are today, past the park. But if there was a overwhelming sentiment of the community that they wanted to have 2 lanes rather than 4, we would certainly consider that.
And by the way, I didn't get a chance to introduce Bill, but Bill Guerin is the Director of Public Works for the city. So we welcome him to this meeting. And he's also a resident of Loch Lomond.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin.
Neighbor. So there's a question here is, does the number of bikers during the week really justify the need for a dedicated bicycle lane?
That the Point San Pedro Road has, given the number of folks that live out there and the posted speeds on the roadway, it definitely justifies opportunities to provide a separated lane or other facility for cyclists so they're not in the traffic lanes. The issue with the park and the BC permit aside, the road has been designated to have bike lanes on it in both the cities and counties' bicycle pedestrian master plans. So this is something that's been on the books for some time. And so this is, some of it was actually implemented when the road was last repaved back in 2014-ish, where certain sections did have bike lanes added at that time. So this is just another step in implementing what's been in existing plans.
Here's a question. How much is this project expected to cost? And it's primarily a restriping project as opposed to a project that involves construction of physical barriers. But so do you have a budget for implementing?
This would be part of just folded into the striping and signage programs that we have elsewhere. There hasn't been a specific dollar amount identified, but again, because there's no physical improvements without any concrete being poured, it's signage and striping, it's extremely low cost and likely could be accomplished with like either county crews to implement it, or it could be contracted out. That would still, assuming this is something that's supported, that would still need to be determined. But from a cost perspective in the grand scheme of road improvements, this is very, very cheap.
So Dan, can you talk a little bit about the approval process and the potential schedule? If this is approved, maybe you can talk about what that approval process is. If it is approved, what kind of schedule are you looking at for implementation?
Well, this would be done as sort of 2 separate steps. The first phase of it would be to do the lane reduction, the merge starting at Loch Lomond Drive or beginning at Loch Lomond, and then the merge that begins shortly after that to the end of the park in the eastbound direction. That could be undertaken later this year if there was support to move forward with it. The remainder of it would be done at a later date. Part of the challenge here, or the issue, is that this road, since it was repaved, is now due for what's called a sealant or micro seal. and it's a pavement preservation material. And so some of it is, the reason for breaking this up is because that treatment would need to be applied. It would make sense to do the striping, obviously, after it was put down instead of beforehand and have to do it again. And so in the interest of getting the 1-lane section in conjunction with the park project, that would be done as a separate thing. And then the remainder of the road, both city and county sections, the respective engineering staffs have been in discussions about how and when that would be implemented. But the remainder of it, including the additional striping in the westbound direction, will be done at that time.
Okay, so yeah, go ahead.
As far as an approval process, I mean, this is in 2 different jurisdictions, so each has its own process for that. From the county side, if there's community support for it, then it would get into a more detailed design in terms of a striping plan. The Board of Supervisors would need to take action to approve the project, particularly as it relates to changes in parking requirements and just in terms of the striping and layout and have you, that those types of things are brought to the board for action. So there's a documentation trail.
And how do you measure community support? I mean, the mere fact that we're getting a lot of comments of concern from residents, seems to imply, now I fully realize that not all residents are commenting, but there's a significant number of people who have expressed concern. So how does that fit in with, moving this forward project or not moving it forward?
Well, on the county side, I mean, it would be discussing it with the district supervisor. If there's a desire to do additional outreach, obviously there's not going to be, you're never going to have everyone agree on something like this all one way or all the other. So to some degree, it's, the concerns of those who are not in favor of it. Are those concerns, can they be addressed? If there are things that are insurmountable, then perhaps the project would be abandoned. But there's definitely an opportunity for a greater community dialogue. The concern is that if, in this case, this is sort of an unusual situation, unlike some other typical striping projects, is that if the bike lane doesn't get put in, then there will not be parking in front of the park. That's kind of the twist with this one, that there's a dependency here too. And that was the impetus, well, one of many, for looking at alternatives to be able to provide the bike lane and so the parking can be retained at the park.
So here's a question. It may be difficult because I don't know if you have anyone from the police department to answer this, but will the San Rafael Police Department provide increased traffic monitor for speeding once the proposed road changes are made? I think one clarification that although the San Rafael Police Department works with the county who uses the highway patrol, this is county jurisdiction or a substantial part of what's being proposed. Although I do believe that there is a working agreement between the 2 agencies that the San Rafael can enforce in that area. I don't know if there's anyone here. Is that part of have you worked with the police department? Let me put it that way on the plan.
Yeah, I'm not aware that the police department is aware of the changes that are being proposed, but certainly the San Rafael Police Department does periodically do traffic enforcement on Point San Pedro Road. As Lauren said earlier, it takes speed setting and other things to make traffic enforcement possible. We've done that along Point San Pedro Road, and the police department does enforce regularly. And if the speed limit here, for instance, changes, they would be enforcing that speed limit as well. I've seen recently several motorcycle cops that are I think they're county employees, but they're also enforcing traffic on Point San Pedro Road. So I think there's definitely opportunities for the police department to enforce the new configuration once it happens.
I've also noticed the extra police out. It might be because that's one of the issues that the coalition currently communicates to the San Rafael Police Department, that there needs to be more enforcement. And although they haven't committed to regularly enforce it, they need to do it enough. And they have really responded to our request positively. So recently, I know I've seen a lot of cops out there in motorcycles doing enforcement in the last 2 weeks, which is probably a good thing. Here's a question. What happens? Is there a possibility of trying this on a trial basis for a period of time to see how well it works? And I'm talking about actually doing the striping, not putting cones out and stuff. And Dan, you mentioned that there's, they're going to be slurry coating the road, and you're not quite sure when that is, but and maybe this person's suggesting that maybe some restriping could be done prior to that time. You could see how well it works.
The challenge with that is that there's still the issue of the existing striping, which would have to be ground out, because you can't obviously have duplicate striping, because the new striping wouldn't align with what's there now. So there's an expense involved in that. And if you're going down the road of doing the striping and putting up signs, then you've essentially installed the project. So there's not really a demonstration per se, other than putting it in. And then, the notion of doing cones and things like that as a temporary thing, cones don't stay put. People will move them on their own, or they'll otherwise disappear.
No, I don't think this person's suggesting that.
Okay.
Here's a comment. What is the basis for your conclusion that traffic will be slower when the road narrows? Won't many drivers speed up to get in front of other cars before the road narrows?
That's certainly a possibility, but given that the platooning effect of vehicles, you can only race ahead so far. And the other factor is with the signal at Loch Lomond Drive, it's going to create that platoon even more so. So when the light turns green, people will all be starting from zero at that point. So there's plenty of time to merge. I think, most people, once they're used to a certain road condition, they're used to dealing with it, and the realization will be that trying to speed up just to get in front of that one car and to get in front of that person, even though there's somebody else in front of you, doesn't really solve anything.
Okay, Lauren, here's a question for you. And I think there's still a lot of confusion, Lauren, about these, flashing yellow lights. So what about a simple flashing light rather than a hybrid beacon?
The guidelines just say at that speed of 40 miles an hour, that's not enough to catch drivers' attention and get them to stop for pedestrians.
Okay. Here's one. And once again, here's our contact information for Dan, Lauren, and myself. So if your question has not been answered, or you wake up tomorrow morning and have another question, please email them directly, and I'll help monitor their responses. Here's a question. Why weren't these issues discussed prior to the construction of the park? I'm talking about the requirement for the bicycle lane.
This is Doran, Public Works Capital Project Division Manager. A lot of times when projects are started, things are revealed. And so as much as we would like to cover all bases in the planning and initiation phase, it doesn't always happen that way. I wish I can detail why the reality of today wasn't revealed, but in my experience, a lot of times these things come up as we're initiating, as we're planning, unforeseen permit issues, unforeseen community questions and issues. So don't have a direct answer. I just know that certain things were revealed during the planning and implementation process.
Okay. Let's see. Again, I'm getting a lot of the questions have been answered. There's a lot of concerns that people have about this new proposal. If you're driving during the commute hours, you're coming home, let's say at 5 o'clock, and you live in Peacock Gap, how much longer will it take you under the new solution than it would now? I mean, are we talking about seconds, 2 minutes?
Theoretically, it shouldn't take you any longer because the capacity of the lane, the single lane is more than capable of accommodating the traffic volumes that exist now.
Okay. Well, I think, again, there's variations of questions that have already been asked that are coming up, but I think overall you've answered the basic questions. Again, there are a lot of comments from people who have major concerns about the impact of this change. There are comments about regarding the county and why weren't these issues resolved prior to the planning for the park. But I think we've covered most of the questions tonight, and it's now, it's about 7:10. So I would encourage you, do you want to, let me do this, Dan, you have any closing statements or comments you'd like to make before we end the meeting in terms of supporting, your proposal or the county's proposal and what people should consider in their analysis of this?
Well, sure. In terms of the park, those familiar with the Americans with Disabilities Act, that park was not even close to being compliant. That was what initiated the need to look at the park situation. That didn't involve doing anything to the roadway. And so until BCDC, which does require permits to do work for like the park because it's along the bay, started digging to their records and brought up this 1971 permit there was no reason for it to be on anybody's radar screen because nobody knew about it. So that's why the issue with the parking and bike lane arose well into the design process for the park. This was something that in terms of looking at the circumstances there, it's a constrained right of way. There's a limited number of things that can be done. Realizing that the road is overbuilt for what was originally supposed to be a lot more development out in China Camp and the Peacock Gap area. There's far more capacity on that roadway than there needs to be. And even factoring in the quarry with gravel trucks and things like that, at least in the eastbound direction, removing a lane is not projected to have any kind of impact whatsoever in terms of traffic flow and volume. if anything, there's, as I've mentioned, there's several safety improvements, safety features that are of benefit to, for example, people coming out of the Marine Drive and Beach Drive neighborhoods, where it's challenging to exit now because of the curvature of the roadway and difficult vision, the ability to see down the road if somebody's coming along. This would enable people to pull out a little further to improve that visibility. And same goes for folks who live along the roadway trying to back out of their driveways or getting in and out of cars. It also provides a continuous facility for cyclists, including, folks. One of the big pushes in terms of reducing traffic volumes is trying to get kids to walk and bike to school more, because that's where a lot of the county's traffic demand comes from, is folks driving their kids to school. So to the extent that can be reduced, that helps as well. So this helps move in that direction. As far as buffered bike lanes and things, those have been done in many places. As an example, if people want to see one that has been done, that was somewhat of a similar situation. It's a much lower volume roadway, but Miller Creek Road between 101 and Las Colinas Avenue in Marinwood, that road was laid out to be 2 lanes in each direction with traffic, again, in anticipation of a lot more development. That road currently has a single lane in each direction, a buffered bike lane, and a parking lane. So that's sort of the same type of concept that's being envisioned here. And as I said, if you have any further questions, feel free to email me.
And maybe a question for Doran Hill. Doran, there were a lot of comments in the Q&A from people who don't understand why BCDC would not be receptive to an exemption to this rule. It's from a rational standpoint, this park park project was done to improve accessibility, and it doesn't make any sense not to have accessible, parking for that park. And the bike lane, they haven't had a bike lane there for 50 years. And so a lot of people don't understand why BCDC would not be open to making an exception.
I tend to agree. As I mentioned earlier, Aaron Riley in particular, as well as others, have had many discussions and have made numerous concessions. And it was more of this is the way it shall be. So I agree. I tend to agree. I wish I had an answer on why they weren't more reasonable. But it's for me to go through the history of a number of iterations and us trying to get compromise and exemptions. It's quite a bit. And so I agree. This was the final decision on BCDC's part.
But why not go back? Why not go back in 2 months and ask them, just instead of just automatically accepting their opinion that they're not going to change their mind?
Yes, that's an option. We've done quite a bit of that already, but I won't say that isn't something that we will try to do again.
Yeah, I think that, if I understand correctly, Damon Connolly is actually on the BCDC board.
I think you're correct.
And I think, Damon's the coalition meets with him on a regular basis, and he's been supportive of a lot of our issues out here. I mean, it seemed like it might be, some people think it might be worth a try, so.
That's an option also. Damon Connolly has been involved, and specifically if he's broached this with BCDC, I don't recall, but that's certainly something that you all have brought up, and I will certainly ask that and see if that's another option, Damon being on the board. So yes, that's something I will definitely pursue.
So my final question is, where do we go from here? You've heard the comments. You've heard the comments of the meeting tonight. You've probably read comments that people have submitted prior to the meeting. I'm sure you'll hear comments after the meeting. So where do we go from here? What is the next step? And I'm asking this to whoever, Dan could answer this, or
Well, we'll be curious to see whatever additional comments come in. If the coalition desires to opine on it, whether in an formal or informal way, that would certainly help guide the discussion. And then, as I said, we talked with Damon, the supervisor, and see in terms of what additional outreach might be desirable. Striping projects, putting the park project aside for the moment, just routine striping projects are not normally something that it doesn't go before the planning commission or anything like that. It's under road maintenance. So there is an action by the board, but it's not typically in a planning sense. It's more formally putting things out to bid, that kind of thing. So this is kind of an unusual situation in many ways. So certainly discussing with the supervisor on next steps, but also what they would like to see. And then, of course, the city certainly has its procedures. I mean, the county is working with the city. The county is taking the lead on it. So we will certainly do that. But whatever actions the city may need to take for their portion of the roadway would also come into play.
Bill, do you want to, Bill Guerin, do you want to, what actions would the city need to take to proceed?
The city is supporting whatever decision gets made by the coalition and the county. We are, our role in this is to create the lane striping that needs to happen in order to make one lane going through this area. Otherwise, our role is very much supporting the coalition and the county in terms of what their decision is on this.
Okay. Again, I want to point out,
and of course, anything that Lauren's doing with the signal, the crossings of each of the intersections.
again, I want to point out that the coalition has not taken a position on this to date. So I want to thank our speakers tonight, Dan and Lauren and Doran and Bill. Thank you for your time tonight. I think you've provided additional education for people, for our residents. And on behalf of them, on behalf of the coalition, I want to thank you for your time. I want to remind people, once again, if you have any questions that weren't answered tonight or comments, please write directly to Dan, Lauren, and myself, and we'll try to get you some answers.
Yeah, Kevin, thank you for coordinating the meeting and being the moderator. I think on behalf of Lauren and I, we're certainly happy to answer any questions that the community has that didn't get answered tonight.
Thanks. So with that, I think we'll go ahead and end the meeting. Again, thank you for spending some time with us. And please, if you have any questions or opinions, positions, please let us know. Thank you very much and have a good evening. Is it over?